Did you hear? Putin controls Trump.
Donald Trump has been a Russian intelligence asset since 1987.
And it's irrefutable evidence of a Russian hoe. And his name is Donald Trump. And like most hoes, he always sounds terrified when he's with his pimp.
At one point in the summit, it will be him and President Putin in a room with no other Americans.
The claim that Putin controls Trump has been repeated so many times, it's become an accepted truth by sheer repetition. But if it's true that Putin is Trump's puppet master, well then, Putin is really bad at it. Let's count the ways. First, the US has increased its troop deployments in Eastern Europe, with the Pentagon allocating $6.5 billion for a military program meant to confront Russia. That's a 91% increase over Obama's last year in office. Such a strange way for Trump to show fealty to Putin. And while the news media was losing its mind over Trump's clownish behavior at the NATO summit over the summer, they seemed to miss the fact that Trump was calling for a massive increase in NATO's budget. Trump's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo even bragged about it.
This same president with which you seem to express such deep concern is engaged in a massive defense buildup, which threatens Vladimir Putin's regime.
Then there's Ukraine, where Trump's administration sent anti-tank missiles, a move Obama resisted to avoid provoking Russia. Not to mention that American weapons and military support are going to Ukrainian neo-Nazis, a scandal the US media has ignored. What was Trump's secret boss Putin thinking with this one? Number 3, Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, something Putin criticized during the infamous Helsinki conference, but American media outlets were strangely silent about it. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed credit for getting Trump to axe the deal, bragging to members of his party that, quote, "we convinced the US president to exit the Iran deal." Oddly enough, there were no panels on CNN to discuss this admission of meddling by a foreign state, because that's the sort of foreign meddling we're supposed to accept and ignore, I guess. Then there were the times Trump increased sanctions on Russia, causing serious damage to Russia's economy. Russia's prime minister has even labeled US sanctions economic warfare. And who can forget the time Trump kicked out those Russian diplomats?
The Russians who will be leaving include 48 members from the Russian embassy and 12 from the United Nations.
Or how about when Trump bombed Syria more than once, which risked escalation with Russia? Not to mention that Trump has repeatedly tried to subvert Russia's gas pipeline Nord Stream 2. Look, the reality is that under Trump, the US is pursuing a very anti-Russia foreign policy, certainly more aggressive than anything pursued by Bush, Clinton, especially Obama. Even a so-called expert at the NATO-funded Atlantic Council says so, telling NPR that this administration has been much tougher on Russia than any in the post-Cold War era. This new Cold War is dangerous for many reasons, the most important being that Russia and the US hold 90% of the world's 16,000 nuclear weapons. So it's necessary for the survival of humankind that these two countries find a way to get along. But instead of encouraging diplomacy, there are people demanding that Trump start a war to prove he's not Putin's bitch.
The striking thing to me is that although he's willing to threaten North Korea, he's willing to threaten Iran, he never threatens Russia.
Then there's the Democratic congressman from Kentucky who got a bit genocidal.
So you want massive cyber attacks against the Russian state to cripple their banking industry?
To cripple everything. If they all fell underneath the Kremlin and were buried together, it'd be too soon.
Representative Cohen later clarified to me that he wasn't referring to all Russians, just the leaders who get Kremlin burial privileges. You could imagine the collective stroke the US press would have if a Russian official called for American government officials to be buried alive under the US Capitol. But, you know, double standards. So why focus so much energy on this notion that Putin controls Trump when it's clearly not true? Is it because American voters care about it? Not even a little. According to a recent Gallup poll, the percentage of Americans who believe the situation with Russia is the most important problem was too small to represent with a number. Meanwhile, this anti-Russia hysteria is causing otherwise smart people to see Russia behind everything bad, distracting us from more urgent and very real crises gripping the country, like voter suppression, or the fact that 63% of Americans don't have enough money in their savings account to cover a $500 medical expense, or that over 3,000 counties have higher levels of lead in their water than Flint, Michigan, or the fact that the 3 richest Americans have more wealth than the bottom half of the country combined. But I guess if I was part of the establishment, if I oversaw such a corrupt and unequal and predatory system that benefits a handful of elites, I would love for the media to spend all day obsessing over Putin and Russia, instead of who and what is behind this miserable status quo. Now, in an effort to preempt the trolls that will no doubt come at me for pointing out the obvious, I'm gonna hand it over to Professor Stephen Cohen to wrap things up.
I don't do defamation of people. I do serious analysis of serious national security problems. When people like you call people like me, and not only me, but people more eminent than me, apologists for Russia because we don't agree with your analysis, you are criminalizing diplomacy and détente, and you are the threat to American national security. End of story.